the meltdown in India's aviation sector, massive job losses at IndiGo. 10% of IndiGo's workforce will be laid off. 3,000 IndiGo employees will be retrenched. Cost savings, the airline has said, is clearly not enough to offset the decline in revenues. IndiGo employs 30,000 people, 10% of whom will be losing their jobs. IndiGo is India's largest airline. They've retrenched employees to get at least 3 months' gross salary, including severance and notice pay. Well, joining us now to look at the meltdown in the Indian aviation sector, Parvez Damania, former director of Kingfisher Airlines, Jitendra Bhargav, former director of Air India. Mr. Damania, let me come to you first. In fact, we've got Kapil Kaul as well. Kapil Kaul on the phone. We'll be joined by Parvez Damania in a moment. Let me come to you, Kapil, first. You know, I've gone through your reports at the Center for Asia Pacific Aviation, and you mentioned that if there was one airline which had some cash reserves, it was IndiGo. And you did say that those cash reserves were finite, but they still had some. Now it appears that those cash reserves have disappeared. What does this mean, for, not just for IndiGo, but for the Indian aviation sector?
Good evening, Vishnu. First of all, I think IndiGo has a war chest. They have roughly about $1.2 to $1.4 billion as a free cash. And they have about roughly another $1.5 billion plus for the restricted cash. And they have recently announced that they need to raise about 3,000 to 5,000 crores. The COVID is going to be basically a long-drawn battle. It's going to be a very painful battle. Survival will depend upon your balance sheet. If you have a very strong balance sheet, even stronger than what IndiGo has right now, that's the only way you can come out. So redundancies from IndiGo are logical. It's in line with the serious downside in business, and I fear that this may be the beginning. So if the leader in the industry is going through such a painful process, having to take 10% people off earlier, closer to 10%, already retrenched, I think the sector is beginning to
unravel.
Unravel, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Jitendra Bhargav, you're former director of Air India. You've seen this aviation sector grow completely. Air India is going to be getting into some sort of they call it a voluntary retrenchment drive. Some would say that in fact there are clauses there which suggest that it's quite forced, or at least on some individuals. Now IndiGo as well. SpiceJet has fewer cash reserves. GoAir has fewer cash reserves. AirAsia slightly unclear at this stage. Vistara much smaller in its operations. So even after COVID, what is it going to take for India's aviation sector to recover?
Vishnu, we need to look at the global scenario. Airlines which are far more stronger, had stronger balance sheets, etc., have also resorted to laying off, slashing of manpower, shrinking of network, of course, and I would say even ensuring that their fleet is downsized. They've all resorted to it because they know it's a prolonged battle for survival. Now, Indian carriers are naturally going to be affected, and barring IndiGo, most of our carriers did not have a strong balance sheet. One could see it coming. If you go back to March, and when ITA gave the figures that there will be $250 billion of revenue loss, 25 million job losses, etc., people presume that it's not going to hit India. Well, it couldn't have been. It's been 7 weeks since the domestic operations had started. With only 45% of the capacity deployment, the load factors are just around 40-odd%. They're not going to be making money. The reality is there has been a huge demand destruction. When people travel, they travel with a purpose. And that purpose presently is missing. Yeah. Whether it's the business meeting, whether it's the leisure, whether it's the social engagement, weddings, family functions, etc., there isn't any reason for a person to travel. So when you do not have revenues coming in, how do you survive? That's the question which everybody who has been affected, also one can sympathize with the employees, but the reality is this could be seen as coming to them, and how many people would you? When you have a fleet of a certain size and using only 20-25% of the aircraft with very limited revenues coming in, and fixed costs have to be met, whether it's the lease rentals, employee salaries, offices, etc., you've got to look at it.
Right.
Now, when we look at
Just
it,
one moment, sir.
IndiGo,
I want to bring up that last graphic onto the screen, the pie chart. Let's bring that up in terms of my last question. Let's have that up full screen so that I can take a look at it carefully, because I want to go through some of these variables. These are important variables. Let's have that up, if we can, full screen. This is what makes it very, very difficult for Indian Airlines, low-cost carriers, to survive. This is what it costs them to work. There are fuel costs, other operating expenses, airport charges, maintenance costs, sales and marketing costs, labor expenses, and lease rentals. Many of our airlines, in fact most of them, lease aircraft from manufacturers and their affiliates, and they have to pay off those lease charges. Fuel, incredibly variable in this country. Parvez Damania joins us now, former director of Kingfisher Airlines. The structure of aviation in India, and the fact that you've got all of these costs and then there is cutthroat competition, does it mean that we were never in a position to deal with anything even close to COVID? Mr. Damania, can you hear me? Mr. Damania, can you hear me? You can, right? Let me put that. Can you hear me, Mr. Damania? Don't look to, yeah, don't look at your side. Can you hear me? Yes or no? Yes? All right, I don't think he can. Let me go across to Jitendra Bhargav. Would you like to take that question, sir?
Yeah, let's look at it. You see, ever since the airlines were opened up, the skies were opened up, our airlines have been chasing passengers at the cost of profitability. The fares have been low. People can always say that, look, you are fleecing, the airline fares go up, etc. The fact is, when you look at the fare per kilometer of passenger flown, the yield has been low. Airlines have ordered huge number of aircraft. They want to fill up those aircraft. So each one has been looking from their own perspective. So whether you look at the legacy carriers were the first victims of cost, because their fares have to be necessarily benchmarked against the low-cost fares. So you had Kingfisher first, you had Jet Airways and Air India, we all know.
Okay,
and
Mr. Bhargav, I've got Mr. Damania back on the line. I'm running short on time. I just want to ask him one quick question. Mr. Damania, where do you see India's aviation sector even after this COVID situation unravels? We were one of the fastest growing markets in the world. Do you believe that it's going to take a long time for us to get back there?
See, I'll tell you something. According to me, the government is doing everything possible to support the sector. I think the government has opened up the sector in time, but I think certain protocols still need to be in place.
Has the government bailed out the sector? Has the government bailed out the sector in a situation like this? Perhaps the government can't bail out the sector. That's a larger issue.
No. The government could do a lot to support the sector. I think even when the finance minister made those announcements, they were not really good enough for the aviation sector.
Right.
The government has opened up the sector, but at the same time, unless we have the quarantine protocols and certain other protocols in place, the sector won't really move. You're aware that Indian aviation was contributing about $72 billion to the GDP. And I think it was the fastest growing market in the world. 4 years in a row, no aviation market in the world grew at this rate.
Right.
But now suddenly this whole thing is crumbling down. Even today, the government can do a lot to support the sector. And the government should do, because this aviation sector
Mr. Damania, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you there just because I'm out of time on this program. We couldn't get your line earlier on. But I'd like to thank both of you for joining us. We'll follow this topic again in the future. Very sad day for IndiGo, 3,000 jobs lost. Imagine what's happening to those families who are going to be affected. Time for a short break.